Now we finally arrive at the first and perhaps the most important knowledge domain of GS2, that is the Constitution. Let me begin by asking you one question. When you hear the word Constitution, what immediately comes to your mind? Some of you will think about the preamble, some will think about fundamental rights, some will think about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, some will think about articles, and some will think about Lakshmikant. But let me ask a deeper question. Why does every administrator in India ultimately come back to the Constitution? A district collector works under the Constitution. A chief minister derives authority from the Constitution. Parliament functions because of the Constitution. The Supreme Court protects the Constitution. The Election Commission exists because of the Constitution. The Comptroller and Auditor General derives its authority from the Constitution. The UPSC itself derives legitimacy from the Constitution. Everything, everything ultimately begins here. That is why I often say the Constitution is not merely the first chapter of the GS2 paper. It is the foundation upon which the entire Indian state stands. Unfortunately, many students prepare the Constitution like a law textbook. They memorize articles, they memorize schedules, they memorize amendments, they memorize committees, and they memorize judgments. And after a few months, they forget most of it. Why? Because they memorized information without understanding purpose. They memorized information without understanding purpose. UPSC rarely rewards that approach. It wants you to understand why does the Constitution exist. It wants you to understand why does the Constitution exist. Let us go back to the 1947. India had become independent. But independence alone was not enough. A newly independent nation needed answers to some fundamental questions. Who would govern and how would power be distributed and how would citizens to be protected? Who would make laws and who would interpret them? How would disputes between the center and the states be resolved? How would elections be conducted? And how would minorities be protected? And how would social justice be achieved? Every one of these questions required a common framework. That framework became the Constitution of India. So remember this, the Constitution is not simply a legal document. It is the political, administrative, and moral framework of the Republic of India. It is the political, administrative, and moral framework of the Republic of India. Now, let me tell you something very important for UPSC. When UPSC asks questions on the Constitution, it It is almost never asking you to reproduce constitutional provisions. Reproduce constitutional provisions. Instead, it asks you to evaluate constitutional principles. Let us understand the difference between those two. If I ask you, what is Article 21? You may write the definition. That is knowledge. But if UPSC asks, discuss the expanding scope of Article 21 in the contemporary governance. If UPSC asks, discuss the expanding scope of Article 21 in contemporary governance, your answer changes completely. You must discuss privacy, digital rights, environmental rights, human dignity, technology, and judicial interpretation. Look at the notice the difference between those two. UPSC moved from article to constitutional philosophy. Constitutional philosophy. That is exactly why reading articles alone is never enough for UPSC. Now let us understand the five pillars of constitutional foundations. Every constitution, every constitutional question asked by UPSC from 2013 to 2025 can broadly be traced back to one of these five pillars. The five pillars of constitutional foundations. The first pillar, the first pillar is constitutional philosophy. What is the constitutional philosophy? This includes the preamble, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, constitutional morality, rule of law, democracy, secularism, republic, socialism, and human dignity. Constitutional philosophies consists of all these values. So these are not merely words, these are the values that guide governance. So comes to the second pillar, fundamental rights and duties. Fundamental rights and duties. Every administrator exercises power and every citizen possesses rights. So the constitution constantly balances these two between exercises power of administrator and citizen possesses rights. So that the balance forms one of the most recurring themes in GS2, that is fundamental rights and duties. Comes to the third pillar, directive principles of state policy. This is also called as DPSP. These are not enforceable in courts like fundamental rights, unlike fundamental rights, but they are enforceable in governance. Directive principles are enforceable in governance. Fundamental rights are enforceable in courts. So whenever you study welfare, poverty, nutrition, education, public health, women's empowerment, and environment, you are actually studying the practical expression of directive principles. This is called as directive principles. These are the directive principles or directions to become the good governance. And the fourth pillar is the basic structure doctrine. This is one of the most interesting and important doctrine, that is pillar basic structure doctrine. Perhaps one of the greatest constitutional innovations in modern democracy across the globe, not only in India. Parliament possesses enormous power, but the power is not unlimited and power is not absolute. The constitution remains supreme. That idea protects Indian democracy. That is called as constitutional supremacy. So comes to the fifth pillar, that is constitutional evolution. How the evolution happened? Constitution. The constitution is not frozen. Why? Because society changes, technology changes, governance changes. Therefore, constitutional interpretation also evolves from time to time. So that is why UPSC increasingly asks questions linking constitutional principles with contemporary developments. Let's say example, digital privacy, data protection, artificial intelligence, electoral reforms, and mainly environmental governance. Every one of these modern issues ultimately comes back to constitutional interpretation. So that is why constitutional evaluation pillar is more important for modern issues interpretation to the constitution. So everything we discussed just now appears repeatedly in previous year questions, not necessarily through the same wording, but through the same constitutional values. Sometimes UPSC asks about fundamental rights, sometimes it asks about judicial review, and sometimes asks about privacy, and sometimes asks about constitutional morality, and sometimes asks about federalism. Different questions they asked, but same constitutional philosophy. So that is why we do not prepare questions, but we prepare principles. From today onwards, whenever you read any current affair, ask yourself one simple question. What is that question? Which constitutional principle is involved here? Equality, liberty, federalism, accountability, transparency, and judicial independence. You have to ask yourself like this: what principle is involved in this particular current affair? So that moment began asking that question, current affairs stop being isolated events. They become constitutional case studies. That is exactly how UPSC wants you to think. So let us summarize. The constitution is not the beginning of GS2 because it appears first in the syllabus. The constitution is not the beginning of GS2 because it appears first in the syllabus. Why and what? It is the beginning because every institution, every policy, every governance reform, every welfare program, every administrative action, and every international commitment of India must ultimately remain faithful to constitutional values. The constitution gives legitimacy. The institutions exercise power. Governance delivers outcomes. Citizens receive justice. So this is constitutional journey of the Indian state. And unless this foundation becomes clear, everything else in CS2 becomes fragmented. Before we move into detailed revision, sit with three questions for a moment, not to answer them now, but to carry them with you through this entire chapter. What are they? The first question is, if there were no constitution, who would decide the limits of government? And second one, Parliament amend every part of the constitution. And third one, should fundamental rights ever be restricted for national security? These three questions, keep them in the back of your mind. We will return to each one as we go. These three questions are important for this. particular chapter. And now, what we understand the philosophical foundations, let us begin our detailed revision. We will start with the historical evolution of the Constitution, move to its salient features, then understand the basic structure, and finally connect each of them with previous year questions, current affairs, and the kind of analytical answers UPSC expects from students in mains. Let us begin. Let us begin with historical underpinnings of the Indian Constitution. Let us beginning with historical underpinnings of the Constitution. Now that we understand why the Constitution is the foundation of the Indian state, let us begin with very first phrase mentioned in the official UPSC syllabus. Read it carefully. That is historical underpinnings of the Indian Constitution. Historical underpinnings of the Indian Constitution. Notice something here. UPSC did not simply write history of the Constitution. Why? It deliberately used the phrase historical underpinnings. Why? Because it is not asking you to memorize dates. It is not asking memorize dates. It wants you to understand the historical forces that shaped our constitution. That is completely different approach. Could India have written the constitution, its constitution in one day? One day? Of course not. Could Dr. B.R. Ambedkar alone have written it? Again, no. Our constitution was not created overnight. It evolved. It evolved. It absorbed experiences, learnt from failures, borrowed successful ideas, and rejected unsuitable ones. In many ways, our constitution is the product of nearly 200 years of constitutional evolution. That journey is what UPSC calls historical underpinnings. Let me something, Let me say something. Imagine you are constructing a modern building. Let's say, for example, before laying the foundation, an engineer studies the soil, the climate, the surrounding environment, the load the building must carry. Similarly, before writing the constitution, India studied its own historical experience, British administration, colonial laws, the national movement, constituent assembly debates, foreign constitutions, administrative realities, social diversity, and economic inequality. Everything they studied, everything became part of the constitutional conversation and constitutional assembly debates. That is why our constitution became both Indian and universal. So let us understand this journey. I do not want you to remember acts. I want you to remember evolution. Evolution. The first phase begins with colonial administration, but gradually trade transformed into political control. As territorial control expanded, administration became necessary, and administration required laws and institutions. Slowly, the foundations of modern governance began to emerge. From 1773, to 1858 and 1909 and 1919 and 1935 and Constituent Assembly and finally 1915. The Regulating Acting Act of 1773 for the first time for the first time accepted that the East India Company could no longer function without parliamentary supervision. This is the beginning of constitutional control over authority. Executive authority. Later, the Pitt's India Act separated political supervision from commercial interests and strengthening governmental accountability. Then came the Charter Acts. Then came the Charter Acts, each gradually expanding administration, centralization, lawmaking, etc. But please, something you have to notice here. Even before independence, India was learning administrative organization. Now comes perhaps the most important phase, the Government of India Acts. The Government of India Acts. Especially in 1935, students often memorize one sentence. Our constitution borrowed heavily from the Government of India Act 1935. This is true, but why would independent India borrow from a colonial law? A question may arise. Because administration must continue. Administration must continue. Independence does not mean administrative collapse. India inherited a functioning administrative framework like provisional autonomy, federal ideas, the office of the governor, public service commissions, the federal court, emergency provisions, and administrative services. The constitution retained what worked, modified what required reform, and rejected what was incompatible with democracy. That is constitutional wisdom, not blind limitation. That is what? Constitutional wisdom, not blind imitation. Now let us move to the freedom struggle. That is where the constitution become truly Indian. The national movement was never merely about removing British rule. It was equally about imagining a new republic, a new republic, fundamental rights, universal adult franchise, federalism, responsible government, social justice, equality, liberty, and fraternity. So, democracy, these ideas matured during the freedom struggle. By the time the Constituent Assembly, by the time Constituent Assembly met, they were already deeply rooted in India's political consciousness. So now let us come to the Constituent Assembly. Many students ask who wrote the Constitution. That question is incomplete. A better question is asked like this. You have to ask like this. Who shaped the Constitution? The drafting committee prepared the text. The drafting committee prepared the text, but the Constituent Assembly debated every important issue like presidential form of government or parliamentary form of government, and should fundamental rights be absolute, and federalism, and single or dual citizenship, and should directive principles be enforceable, should reservations be included. These debates lasted for nearly 3 years. And almost every important constitutional principle emerged through discussions only. So that is why constitution enjoys democratic legitimacy. So it was debated before it was adopted. That thing you have to be understand. Now let me address something UPSC loves to asking. What is that? The constitution is often described as borrowed constitution. I think that expression is misleading. Why? India certainly borrowed constitutional ideas, but borrowing does not mean copying. When a doctor, let me say one thing. Let me say something clearly. When a doctor, for example, when a doctor studies medical research from different countries, he is not copying there. He is learning. Similarly, Similarly, our constitution borrowed successful practices from around the world and across the globe. Parliamentary government from Britain we have taken, and judicial review from the United States of America, and directive principles from Ireland, and fundamental duties from the Soviet Union, and emergency provisions inspired partly by Germany, and federalism from Canada. But every borrowed idea was carefully adapted to Indian realities, not as it is. Our constitution is not a copy, it is a carefully designed constitutional synthesis. Constitutional synthesis. So, whenever UPSC asks about constitutional evolution or historical foundations, it is not asking you to reproduce acts chronologically. Not, certainly not. It expects you to answer three questions. What are the questions? First one, what historical problem existed? And second, how did constitutional development respond to the problem? And third one is, what is the relevance of that constitutional principle today? That is analytical thinking, not historical narration. Whenever, let me repeat it again. Whenever UPSC asks about constitutional evolution or historical foundations, it is not asking you to reproduce acts chronologically. Then what it is asks? It expects you to answer three questions. What are the three questions? First one, what historical problem existed and how did constitutional development respond to that problem? And what is the relevance of that constitutional principle today? That is analytical thinking, not historical narration. So let us summarize. The constitution did not emerge in isolation. It emerged from colonial experience, administrative evolution, the freedom struggle, comparative comparative constitutional learning from across the globe, and democratic debate. The constitution did not emerge in isolation, emerged from all these debates. That historical journey explains why the Indian constitution looks the way it does today. That experience, that historical journey explains why the Indian constitution looks the way it does today. Unless we understand that journey, simply we can memorize constitutional provisions, but we can never truly understand the constitution. So we have to understand that journey. Then only we understand the truly understand the constitutional. Just simply memorize constitutional provisions is not equal to understand the journey and not equal to understand the constitution. And UPSC rewards understanding, not memorization. I am telling you again and again. With that historical foundation in place, we can now ask what actually emerged from it. We can now ask what actually emerged from it. What kind of constitution did India finally build now? And what makes it distinctive among the constitutions of the world? So that is exactly what we shall study next. The salient features of the Indian constitution. We are going to, again, I am saying, now we understand where the constitution came from. Where the constitution came from. But another question naturally arises. What is that question? What kind of constitution did India finally create? Let me say one thing. Every country writes a constitution, but yet no two constitutions are identical. The United States looks different. The United Kingdom functions differently. France, Germany, Japan, each follows another model. Why does India's constitution look the way it does? The answer lies in one simple idea. What is that simple idea? The constitution reflects the society it governs. The way society in their particular nation, the governance should be like this, like that, and constitution also reflect that only. And India, in perhaps one of the most diverse societies in the world, India consists of multiple religions, multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple ethnic identities, and different levels of development, and different historical experiences, and different regional, particularly different regional aspirations. A constitution for such a society could never be simple. Please understand this. The diversity is vast, geography also vast. So constitution for such a society should could never be simple. It had to be balanced, unity with diversity, and liberty with equality, rights with duties, democracy with stability, and development with justice. All these have to balance. That is why the Indian constitution possesses certain unique features. So today we are going to understand them, not memorize them. And first and foremost, we are going to learn salient features of the Indian constitution. First one, a constitution, a constitution that is both detailed and practical. Many students simply memorize the Indian constitution is the longest written constitution in the world. That is information. But UPSC expects analysis from you. They ask, UPSC asks, why is it so detailed? Why? We have to think from that way. We are going to start thinking from this point. So because India could not afford ambiguity, constitutional ambiguity. A newly independent country with enormous diversity required clarity, because enormous diversity, clarity, administrative powers, center state relations, emergency provisions, election machinery, public services, fundamental rights, local governments, schedules, languages, etc. The constitution became detailed not because it makers loved writing elaborately, but because they wanted stability. Because newly independent, diverse nation could not afford ambiguity, constitutional ambiguity. So that is why our constitution has been detailed and practical. Then comes to the second feature, that is parliamentary democracy. From Britain, parliamentary system, prime minister, council of ministers, collective responsibility we have taken. Students remember this easily. But why did India chooses this model rather than presidential form of government? Because India wanted responsible government. The executive must remain accountable to the legislature. Power should never become absolute. The government should answer questions, face debates, seek parliamentary approval. That is why we have taken parliament. We have chosen parliamentary democracy rather than presidential form of government. UPSC is always more interested in why than what. And third feature, the federal system with unitary bias. This is one of the UPSC's favorite area. Think like a constitution maker. We experienced partition, princely states, regional diversity, economic inequalities, national integration. India needed both national unity and regional autonomy. So, in this point of time, our constitution distributes powers between the union and the states. But whenever national integrity is threatened, it strengthens the union. So that is why strong center, federal with unitary bias. This is why India is often described as a federation with a strong center. Not because federalism is weak, but because national unity was considered essential for constitutional survival. And comes to the fourth salient feature, that is blend of rigidity and flexibility. Some provisions require a simple parliamentary majority for amendment, some a special majority, and some special majority with some ratification by the states. Simple majority, special majority with half of the states ratification. Why this type of rigidity and flexibility? Why in the making of laws? Because every constitutional principle does not deserve the same level of protection. Because routine changes should remain easy, fundamental constitutional values should remain stable. That balance between continuity and change makes the constitution dynamic. That is why this rigidity and flexibility is need of the hour. And it comes to the fifth salient feature, that is an independent judiciary. This is one of the most salient feature in Indian Constitution. Why must judges remain independent? Why? Why? Because the Constitution is supreme. If the judiciary become dependent on the executive, who will review unconstitutional laws? Who will resolve center state disputes? Who will defend minorities? And who protect individual liberty? So, judicial independence is not a privilege of judges, it is a protection of citizens. That is why independent judiciary is need in our constitution. Comes to the sixth salient feature, that is fundamental rights and directive principles. One of the greatest constitutional balance, fundamental rights and directive principles. Fundamental rights protect individual liberty and directive principles guide social transformation. One protects freedom and other promotes justice. Together they ensure democracy remains both political and social. So that is why fundamental rights and directive principles is salient feature of Indian Constitution. And seventh one, that is universal adult franchise. Today voting appears normal, but in 1950s it was revolutionary because many developed countries introduced universal voting rights gradually. India introduced it from the very beginning, regardless of education, income, gender, religion, or social status. Universal adult franchise is not merely an electoral provision, it is the constitutional recognition of human dignity. And comes to the eighth salient feature, that is secular democratic republic. Indian secularism does not mean hostility towards religion, nor complete separation between religion and the state. It means equal protection, equal citizenship. The republic means public authority comes from the people, not from hereditary privilege. Public authority comes from the people in the republic, not from hereditary privilege. So, after reading these salient features, why has UPSC repeatedly asked about basic structure, judicial review, federalism, parliament, rights, directive principles, constitutional morality, privacy, and democracy? Why? Because these are all expressions of the same constitutional philosophy, like limited government, responsible government, accountable government, and a constitutional government. Every constitutional question eventually comes back to these four ideas. So now let us connect this with answer writing. Suppose UPSC asks, discuss the importance of judicial independence. This is the question. An average answer defines it lists provisions and end. That's it. But a high scoring answer first establishes the constitutional philosophy, explain why judicial independence protects constitutional supremacy, then discusses contemporary challenges, then analyzes institutional safeguards, and finally suggests reforms while preserving judicial autonomy. First, constitutional philosophy, then judicial independence protects the constitutional supremacy, then contemporary challenges, then institutional safeguards, then reforms suggestion. So same topic, different depth. That is why UPSC rewards second one. So let us summarize. The salient features are not random characteristics. Each one solves a constitutional problem. A detailed constitution ensures administrative clarity. Parliamentary government ensures accountability. Federalism balances unity and diversity. An independent judiciary protects constitutional supremacy. Fundamental rights protect liberty. Directive principles pursue social justice. Universal adult franchise guarantees political equality. Secularism protects equal citizenship. All these solve one constitutional problem. So once you understand purpose behind each feature, you no longer memorize the constitution, you understand it. So that is why these salient features are not random characteristics. Each one solves a constitutional problem, from parliamentary form of government, detailed constitution, federalism, independent judiciary, fundamental rights and DPSP, directive principles of state policy, and secularism, universal adult franchise. So our constitutional principle, however, stands above every amendment. So every government, every parliament, and every political majority, it tells us that although parliament has enormous powers, those powers are not unlimited. That principle is basic structure doctrine. In my opinion, one of the greatest constitutional innovations in the history of modern democracy. One more thing, and I have to repeat it again. One constitutional principle, however, it stands above every amendment. It stands above every government. It stands above every parliament. It stands above every political majority. That is what. What is that? It tells us that although parliament has enormous powers, those powers are not unlimited. That principle is the basic structure doctrine. Basic, the basic structure doctrine. In my opinion, one of the greatest constitutional innovations in the history of modern democracy, that is the basic structure doctrine. Let us understand why the basic structure doctrine. Now we come to the one of the greatest constitutional innovations, not only in India but in the entire world, that is the basic structure doctrine. Whenever students hear the topic, they immediately become nervous. Keshavananda Bharati case, 24th, 25th, and 29th amendments, 13 judges, 7 versus 6, long judgments, endless articles, etc. etc. Today, I want to teach this differently. I don't want you to remember judgment. I want you to understand a constitutional idea. Once the idea becomes clear, the judgment automatically becomes meaningful. Let me say something very clearly. Imagine tomorrow Parliament passes a constitutional amendment saying that India will no longer hold elections. Another amendment says the judiciary will no longer have the power of judicial review. Another says fundamental rights are abolished. Can Parliament legally do this? I'm asking you. Article 368 gives Parliament to power to amend the Constitution. Amend the Constitution. It has amendment power. Can it amend absolutely everything? No. This question troubled India during the first 25 years after independence. In the early years of the Republic, Parliament wanted to implement major socio-economic reforms, that land reforms, abolition of Jamindari, redistribution of resources. So on that, in that context, what happened? Many were challenged before the Supreme Court, and a constitutional conflict slowly emerged. Parliament argued, we represent the people, therefore we should have the authority to amend the constitution. But that for that, the judiciary argued the constitution is supreme. No institution can destroy its fundamental identity. Notice something here. This was not a fight between parliament and the judiciary. It was a debate about constitutional democracy itself. Something argued parliament and something argued the judiciary. This is just a debate rather than this is not a fighting between parliament and the judiciary. This debate reached the highest point in 1973 Keshavananda Bharati case. A bench of 13 judges, the largest in Indian judicial history, heard arguments for several months and finally delivered a judgment that permanently changed Indian constitutional law. Parliament, the court said, has very wide powers to amend the constitution. It may even amend fundamental rights, but it cannot destroy the basic structure of the constitution. This single sentence changed Indian constitutional history. In this court said, simply I am telling you, court said, Parliament, dear Parliament, you have wide powers, very wide powers to amend the constitution, including fundamental rights. But it cannot destroy the basic structure of the constitution. This sentence, this judgment given by Supreme Court. So what exactly is the basic structure? Here the question arises. Is there a list in the constitution? No. Did the constitution define it? Again, no. Where did it come from? The Supreme Court explained that every constitution has an identity. Just as every human being has one identity, like made up of certain essential characteristics, etc., etc. If those disappear, the constitution may continue to exist on paper, but it will no longer be the same constitution. That essential constitutional identity is called the basic structure. Let me illustrate simply. Just thinking of a tree. You may cut some branches, trim the leaves, even reshape it. But if you destroy the roots, what happen? What will happen? The tree dies. Similarly, the constitution may evolve, be amended, be modernized, but its foundational principles cannot be destroyed. Those foundational principles are roots. Those cannot be destroyed. Over the years, the Supreme Court has identified several elements like constitutional supremacy, rule of law, judicial review, judicial review, federalism, secularism, democracy, republican government, separation of powers, free and fair elections, parliamentary system, independence of judiciary, fundamental rights, unity and integrity of India, and constitutional morality. The court never, these are comes under basic structure doctrine, court said. The court never claimed this list was closed because democracy evolves, governance evolves, society evolves, and therefore constitutional interpretation also evolves. This is not a closed list. Basic structure doctrine, it may be, it is evolved, it evolves. Why this doctrine so important? So imagine there were no basic structure doctrine. What will happen? Suppose one government enjoyed an overwhelming parliamentary majority. Could it abolish elections, remove judicial review, permanently extend its own tenure, eliminate federalism, suspend democracy forever? Technically, if amendment power were unlimited, all these possibilities would exist. The basic structure doctrine prevents that. It tells every government, no matter how powerful you are, the constitution is more powerful than you. That is the constitutional supremacy. Supreme power is in the constitution itself. The doctrine therefore protects three things simultaneously. It protects democracy from authoritarianism. Democracy from authoritarianism. It protects citizens from arbitrary constitutional change, and it protects constitution from the temporary political majorities. So these three protected by basic structure doctrine. Of course, every constitutional doctrine attracts criticism. Some scholars argue it gives enormous power to the judiciary, and some scholars, since judges, not the constitution, determine what the basic structure contains, increasing judicial activism. Some says, others respond that the doctrine does not weaken democracy, it protects it without constitutional limits. Even elected government may gradually weaken constitutional institutions. So UPSC is not asking you to take extreme positions here. It wants balanced constitutional reasoning. So now let us connect with this answer writing. Suppose UPSC asks critically a question, critically examine the significance of the basic structure doctrine. Basic structure doctrine. So a high scoring answer first identifies the constitutional problem, like can amendment power remain unlimited, then explains the evolution of doctrine, analyzes its contribution to constitutional supremacy, evaluates criticism regarding judicial overreach, and concludes with a balanced observation. The doctrine protects constitutional democracy while requiring judicial restraint in its application. This is the way you have to write the answer. Now I'm again telling you the critically examine the significance of the basic structure doctrine. This is the question. First and foremost, what you have to do after reading the question is identify the constitutional problem here. What is the constitutional problem? Can amendment power remain unlimited? That is the constitutional problem. Then comes what? Explain the evolution of the doctrine through Keshavananda Bharati. How it evolution. Then analyze its contribution to constitutional supremacy. How it contributes to constitutional supremacy. Then evaluate criticisms like judicial overreach or necessary safeguards, judicial overreach versus necessary safeguard, and judicial activism. Then conclude protects constitutional democracy while requiring judicial restraint. This is the way you have to write an answer. So let us summarize simply. The basic structure doctrine does not reduce the authority of parliament, nor does it make the judiciary supreme. This sentence you have to be very clear. The basic structure doctrine does not reduce the authority of parliament, does not reduce the authority of parliament, and nor does it make the judiciary supreme. It remains every constitutional institution that no institution is above the constitution. This is called as constitutional supremacy. No institution is above the constitution in the constitutional institution. So parliament makes laws, the executive implements them, the judiciary interprets them, but the constitution governs all three. That is the essence of constitutional democracy. And perhaps the greatest lesson the basic structure doctrine teaches us. Here, always telling the simple thing constitution supremacy. constitutional supremacy. We now understand the constitutional identity of India. The next question moves from identity to distribution. Till now, what we learned so far, constitutional foundations. We discussed five pillars: philosophy, rights and duties, DPSP, basic structure and evolution. Then eight salient features of the constitution, from parliamentary democracy to secularism, and comes to the historical underpinnings, how to evaluate the evolution of the constitution, not to memorize the dates, and comes to basic structure doctrine that parliament cannot approve. And one takeaway here, UPSC tests constitutional philosophy, not provisions. So, how is constitutional power actually shared across the country? And how does India remain united despite extraordinary diversity? That takes us the next major theme, that is federalism and center state relations.